Good evening. What a pleasure to be part of this incredible evening with such amazing award recipients. I'm here to introduce Francis Collins as the Lifetime Achievement Awardee from the Arthur C. Clarke Foundation. The genome of humans made him a star. He might have preferred a claim on guitar. He grew up on a rural farm and somehow found a way to charm both sides of the aisle. That takes a very special style. His parents were in drama. He worked for Obama, then later Trump and Biden. Longevity there's pride in. From cancer moonshot to opioids, from tackling COVID to amyloid, increasing the research budget, not letting the grantees fudge it. He sought to study all of us. He worked to keep the public's trust. A man of great complexity, as well as some dexterity, embracing faith and science, he's not famed for his silence, appears on all the channels, but no more on the manels. You'll want him for your cause. Let's give him our applause.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the recipient of the Clarke Award, Dr. Francis Collins, receiving the Award of Lifetime Achievement.
It is our special honor to present the Lifetime Achievement Award for exceptional contributions in leadership in genomic and medical research and public health.
I don't think I've ever had such a poetic introduction. And thank you, that was really gracious and kind of funny too. I want a copy of that if I might please get it. What a privilege to be here with all of you and to follow these two distinguished awardees to come to this podium and say just a few words about my own background as it might be relevant to this Arthur C. Clarke Award before we engage in a conversation with our distinguished moderator, Steve Scully. But my thanks to the foundation, particularly to Walda, for convening this gathering and giving me a chance to learn from all of you in various conversations over the course of the last few hours. Looking back over the time that I've had the privilege of serving as a scientist in various locations, first at the University of Michigan, and then for the last almost 30 years within the federal government, leading the Human Genome Project, then as the National Institutes of Health Director for 12 years, and currently as a special projects advisor to President Biden. It has just been an amazing ride in terms of what science has made possible in the course of these almost 40 years. Thinking back to my initial efforts as an assistant professor in Ann Arbor, trying to tackle a problem that I thought was really important but seemed almost unsolvable, working with others, building teams, trying to figure out how you could locate the cause of a terrible disease when you didn't know anything about it. And ultimately, after many blind alleys and frustrations, discovering the cause of cystic fibrosis back in 1989. And that was the kind of effort which today could be done by a pretty good graduate student in about 2 days with appropriate equipment. So it tells you how far we have come over that time. But for me as a physician, it's incredibly gratifying to say that finally now, after some 30 years since that discovery, people with cystic fibrosis, 90% of them have access to a therapeutic that allows them not just to think about the next hospitalization, but to think about what they might want to do in retirement when they get to be 65. What a blessing it is to be able to see progress happening at that scale. But we needed to go faster. For me, as the chance ahead of leading the Genome Project, to be able to read out for the first time that first reading of the remarkable script, the DNA instruction book of Homo sapiens, and to see the way that is played out is also both exhilarating but frustrating. We now have the opportunity for virtually anybody with cancer to find out exactly what are the misspellings in your cancer that is causing those good cells to go bad, and how could we pick the right solution that would enable a good outcome from that. And we've seen some dramatic results. I have to say, though, my heart is a little heavy tonight because I spent time this morning at the bedside of a dear friend who is dying from metastatic kidney cancer, for whom all of those efforts ultimately did not succeed. And we still have a long way to go to be able to say, stage 4 cancer, no big deal. We got that one. We don't have that one yet, but we could get there with genomics, with immunotherapy. Goodness, the brain, the most complicated structure in the known universe, residing between your ears with its 86 billion neurons with incredible complexity, the circuits they're engaged in. We're starting to figure out how that works. It's going to be a long time before we completely are able to get our heads around this. Are our brains complicated enough to understand our brains? That might be a question to consider. But the way in which that plays out in terms of our understanding of things like autism, schizophrenia, PTSD, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, all those things are waiting for that next generation of major leaps that come out of the basic science understanding about how the brain works. For me as a geneticist, to see what's now becoming more and more possible with gene therapy, using this remarkable development of CRISPR, the gene editing capabilities, which nobody even heard about until about 6 or 7 years ago, and which is now being used by almost every laboratory, not just for basic science, but also for therapeutics, to see the opportunities there for those thousands of genetic diseases where we know the misspelling in the DNA, but at the moment we don't have a solution. This is a potential solution and a scalable solution, because if you could figure out how to deliver that gene editing apparatus to the right tissue in the right patient at the right time, then you don't have to go through the incredibly complicated and expensive process of sorting out every one of those genetic conditions at the metabolic level. And some of that is starting to seem actionable. Sickle cell disease, the very first molecular disease, which we knew the cause of, going back to Linus Pauling, for heaven's sake, and yet has basically been there waiting for an answer. And we are now curing people with sickle cell disease with gene editing. And that needs to be scaled, of course, to the point where it can be offered to the 100,000 people in the United States and the 5 million in sub-Saharan Africa. But we might be able to get there too. So I'm pretty jazzed about all of this in terms of the moment that we live in right now in terms of science. And I'm excited about the ways in which that not only leads to new discoveries, but the opportunity to implement them. And a big effort that I'm engaged in right now in the White House is to try to take one of those big developments of the last 10 years, the development of a cure for a disease called hepatitis C, and make sure it actually gets to the people who need it. And that is a little bit of the not so positive part of our national story, that there are 3 million people right now in our country who are chronically infected with hepatitis C and who, without interventions, are headed for liver fibrosis, liver cirrhosis, liver failure, maybe need for a liver transplant, and liver cancer. A very dark future and a very expensive future. And yet, because of the cost of the therapy and the fact that it's therefore had many barriers put up for people who don't have exceptionally good healthcare coverage, those 3 million people, for the most part, are just waiting. If we're a nation that cares about all our people, if we stand up for what the moral principle of taking care of people when you can, this doesn't seem like a good outcome. And guess what? It also has a wonderful side of it, which is likely to make it doable, which is it's both morally the right thing to do and economically it's the right thing to do. Because if you find those people and treat them, you're going to save our country about $26 billion in downstream healthcare costs that won't be necessary because they won't end up with those terrible consequences. You can tell I'm a little worked up about this one. But finally, before I use up all my 10 minutes, let me reflect a minute on COVID, because that has been an absolutely compelling, overwhelmingly exhausting, amazing, inspiring, hardworking effort of the entire scientific community since that day in January 10th of 2020, when the sequence of SARS-CoV-2 first was placed on the internet and we all knew what we were up against. And for me as the NIH director at the time, the challenge was to try to figure out how to not waste a single day to develop the vaccines, the therapeutics, the diagnostics that we were going to need if we were going to save lives. And it was amazing to see, and I hope historians will note this in the midst of all the other difficulties we've had in the last 2.5 years, about how the scientific community came together to respond to this. without worrying about who was going to get the credit or which sector you were in, public sector, private sector, CDC, FDA, everybody gathering around the same table to say, okay, what can we do and how quickly can we do it? And watching that made me believe that we have in science a real way to respond to a crisis that was even better than I thought. And the vaccines that came out of this, remember, most of the time vaccines take 5-10 years to develop. Within just 63 days, the first phase 1 trial was underway for the messenger RNA vaccines from Moderna, and shortly after that from Pfizer-BioNTech. And then this phase 2 and then the phase 3 trials. And there was that moment in November 2020 when the phase 3 trials had reached their endpoint. Remember, these are all done blinded. So even the people who are administering the shots don't know if this is the vaccine or a dummy. And the people receiving them don't know either. And every one of these trials required 30,000 people to be sure we had enough power. And we should be grateful to those people forever that they signed up to take part in such a trial. And nobody knows until you basically unblind the data and see, did it work? Some of us working on this, dreaming about this, dared to hope that maybe it would work, and maybe it would even be something like 60 or 70% effective, and maybe there wouldn't be too many bad side effects. And then there was that night in November 2020 where the data was revealed, and the efficacy was 95%. And the side effects in those 30,000 people, you couldn't tell the difference between the vaccine and the placebo. I got to say, I cried pretty hard that night. This was like unbelievable answer to prayer. And I thought, okay, we're going to be all right here. We're going to get this done. Let's get those vaccines out there into people's arms. And that's what everything was happening with warp speed and all the other things attached to it. And for a while, it seemed like we were on the right track. But then, as you know, it didn't all entirely work that way. And this is maybe what we'll talk about in the course of our conversation, because I've given you a lot of positives, but there's this other big worrisome thing right now, which is that 50 million people in this United States, this most advanced technological country in the world, have decided those vaccines are not for them, and that they're dangerous, they're unproven, they have all kinds of other negative effects, and they have decided to say no. And that, of course, is a kind of conversation that you would hope would happen in an open and free environment. But of course, it was colored over, as you all know, by lots of other forces of information and sometimes misinformation and sometimes potential disinformation, contributed to by political figures as well as social media, cable news, and all the rest. Kaiser Family Foundation, which I think is a pretty trustworthy, objective operation, did a model of how many people died because of misinformation about vaccines. It's frightening. 330,000 people are currently in graveyards because of their decision that vaccines were not going to be safe or appropriate for them. Our culture wars killed 330,000 people. And along with that became, unfortunately, a growing sense of divisiveness about almost everything, a tribalism, and a distrust in authoritative sources, including government. And that in turn added to a sense of growing science distrust. This is a thing that we should all be deeply concerned about. If our nation has a future, and yet we've separated ourselves out from making decisions based on evidence, objectivity, and science, how are we ever going to solve climate change or all the other things that lie in front of us? So what are we going to do about it? I'll make a minor, modest suggestion of one or two things, and then I bet we'll end up talking about this a bit. One is we need to understand human behavior better than we do. And I will personally take responsibility for having underinvested in human behavioral research prior to this to try to understand how people actually make decisions. I thought Descartes was right. I think, therefore I am. You're presented with objective information, you make a rational decision. That didn't turn out to be the way our brains actually work. The information deficit model, as it's called, where you only make a bad decision because you have an information deficit. You fill that in and then everybody will do the right thing. it does not apply, and it probably never has. And it was David Hume who got it more right, which is reason is a slave to the passions. And we got a lot of passions right now, and they're in many ways pushing reason aside. Maybe Pascal was closer to it. The heart has its reasons that reason knows not of. Our hearts are driving us in ways that our brains and our cherished rationality doesn't always figure out is there or how to deal with it. We're all really good at cognitive bias, whether we'd like to admit it or not, and that applies to me as well. So we need more behavioral research to understand that. But we also need to figure out a way to spread science to people who need to understand it, where it doesn't come across as a bunch of elitists who are basically not seen as people that currently are part of the community or people that you can trust. And unfortunately, a lot of our science communication is of that sort, including what I've done and many different appearances in the media. We need to figure out how to turn that into a much more networked situation. Maybe what we need is a science communication corps, where we would enlist all of the members of the scientific societies who know something about science. We would enlist all of the science majors in colleges and universities. We would enlist all the science clubs in high schools. We would ask a lot of the people who participate in our clinical studies, like the All of Us study that's enrolled already 500,000 people in trying to understand how genes and environment play out in health. Make them ambassadors as well about what we know and what we don't know. Provide them with the kind of materials so that they're not stuck out there without backup, that is clear and objective, it is well situated, it is nonpartisan. And I'm sorry to say, probably this would have to be funded not by the government, because that would immediately be suspicious, but by some other kind of philanthropy. That's kind of a dream that I'm kicking around, and I'd love to know what other people would think about it. And maybe we could even engage in that. The faith community, because I'm a person of faith. One of my deepest sorrows of what's happened in the last 2.5 years is how faith communities like mine, I'm an evangelical Christian, have been brought into this mindset which has very little to do with the foundations of faith and everything to do with the political stance and the tribalism, and bring all of us back together to those principles about love and grace and truth, which unfortunately are a little hard to find these days. Maybe that is another part of what we could do. But this is not going to happen quickly. But if we have a future, I don't think we can just hope for the best, although I'm a guy who likes hope as well, and I like the definition that I heard earlier. We got to figure out how, for those of us who really do understand the consequences of continuing down this path, how can we turn this around? How can we turn ourselves back into a nation that cares for all of its people, but cares about the truth? Thank you all very much.